The rain battered the rooftops of Willow Creek, a small town in rural Minnesota where the cobblestone streets held stories of simple and genuine lives. In a modest house on Maple Street, old George watched the raindrops through the foggy window, his tired eyes trying to follow their path down the glass. At 78 years old, he had grown accustomed to the loneliness that echoed through the empty rooms since Martha had departed on her eternal journey. The clock on the wall showed 7:43 p.m., but for George, the hours didn't make much sense anymore. Alzheimer's, his unwelcome companion for several years now, played with his memories like a mischievous child with a jigsaw puzzle, mixing pieces, hiding others, sometimes showing images he wasn't sure were real or created by his confused mind. "Did I take my medicine today?" he muttered to himself, looking at the pill organizer on the kitchen table. He rose with difficulty from the worn armchair, his body responding more slowly than he would like. The wooden cane, a gift from some distant birthday, guided his hesitant steps down the dimly lit hallway. In the kitchen, he ran his wrinkled fingers over the compartments of the pill organizer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. What day was it again today? He sighed, feeling that familiar wave of frustration that always visited him when his memories betrayed him. He went to the calendar hanging on the fridge, another trick he had learned, to maintain some control over his increasingly hazy days. A different sound cut through the silence of the rainy night. At first, George thought it was just the wind howling through the cracks of the old windows, but there was something more. An insistent scratching like nails against metal came from the direction of the gate. His heart sped up slightly, not from fear, but from a long-dormant curiosity. He approached the living room window, wiping the foggy glass with the sleeve of his wool sweater. The light from the street lamp on the sidewalk, though weak, allowed him to make out a dark shape by the gate. His eyes, no longer so sharp, focused with difficulty on the silhouette moving in the rain. "Must be just my head playing tricks again," he muttered, but the sound persisted, now accompanied by a low, pained whimper. Something in that lament stirred George in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if a distant memory was trying to emerge from the depths of his confused mind. With slow but determined steps, he headed for the door. His trembling hands turned the key in the lock, and the cold night wind invaded the room along with a few raindrops. Shielding his eyes with one hand, he walked to the gate, his cane firm on the wet ground to avoid slipping. There, poorly illuminated by the yellowish light of the street lamp, was a large dog with a brown coat soaked by the rain. The animal was visibly debilitated, its ribs apparent under the matted fur, and several scars marked its body. But it was the dog's eyes that captured George's attention. There was a silent plea in them, a deep sadness that seemed to mirror his own loneliness. The old man felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if this encounter wasn't just a coincidence, as if some greater force had guided this animal to his gate on this stormy night. His hands, normally unsure, moved with surprising certainty to unlock the padlock. The dog didn't move. Immediately when the gate was opened, it stayed there, looking at George as if asking permission, as if understanding that it was about to enter not just a house, but the life of someone who, like him, carried his own invisible scars. "Come," George called softly, his voice almost lost in the sound of the rain. "You're safe here." The animal hesitated for a few more seconds before slowly crossing the gate, its paws leaving wet marks on the path to the porch. There it huddled in a corner, shaking itself to remove excess water, its eyes never leaving the old man's face. At that moment, something changed in the house on Maple Street. The silence that had previously weighed like a tombstone on George's shoulders began to dissipate, filled by the soft sound of his new companion's breathing. And for the first time in a long time, the old man felt that maybe, just maybe, loneliness didn't have to be his only companion. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. The next morning dawned with a shy sun trying to break through the remaining clouds from the storm. Old George woke up earlier than usual, a different anxiety moving his aged body. For a moment, as he adjusted his slippers on his feet, he questioned, whether the events of the previous night had been real or just another of the confused dreams that used to visit his lonely nights. That's when he heard it. A soft sound of paws on the living room floor, followed by a canine sigh. His heart warmed as he confirmed that no, it hadn't been a dream. The dog was really there, lying near the living room door, as if standing guard. Seeing George, the animal raised its head and wagged its tail slightly, its eyes showing. A mix of gratitude and loyalty that deeply touched the old man. "We need to give you a name," muttered George, walking to the kitchen with the dog at his heels. As he prepared his breakfast, a distant and hazy memory began to form in his mind. Something about a strong, imposing name. "Thor," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the clarity of that specific memory. The dog reacted to the name, its ears moving with interest. "So that's it, you'll be Thor." Gradually, a new routine began to establish itself in the house. Thor seemed to perfectly understand George's limitations, always staying close, especially in moments when the old man's mental confusion intensified. When George got lost in the rooms, forgetting where he was going, Thor gently guided him back to his original destination, as if he could read his thoughts. It was on a particularly confusing afternoon that something strange happened for the first time. George was looking for his glasses, which he was sure he had left on the living room table. Thor was watching him attentively when, suddenly, he got up and walked decisively to the bedroom. Curious, the old man followed him, finding his glasses perfectly placed on the nightstand. "But I don't remember leaving them here," he muttered to himself, frowning. Thor just looked at him, his intelligent eyes keeping secrets that George couldn't decipher. In the days that followed, small inexplicable events began to accumulate. Objects changed places during the night. Doors he was sure he had closed would be found ajar in the morning. One particular morning, George found a folded note on the kitchen table. With trembling hands, he unfolded the yellowed paper, revealing handwriting that seemed strangely familiar. "Trust him." At first, he attributed everything to his faulty memory. After all, Alzheimer's often made him question his own actions. But there was something different about these occurrences, a feeling that forces beyond his comprehension were at work. Mrs. Nancy, his closest neighbor, began to visit more frequently, intrigued by the changes she observed in George since Thor's arrival. "You're different, Mr. George," she commented during one of her visits, serving him a piece of cornbread. "More present, you know, as if you've woken up from a long sleep." George smiled, patting Thor's head, who was lying at his feet. "It's this guy here who works miracles, Mrs. Nancy. Sometimes I think he knows more about me than I do myself." Was that same afternoon that Mrs. Nancy mentioned something that made George's heart freeze. "You know, the other day I saw a man standing in front of your house. I'd never seen him around here before. I kept watching for a while, but he left when he realized he was being observed." Thor, who until then had been resting peacefully, abruptly raised his head upon hearing the comment, his ears on alert. George felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in the dog's eyes at that moment, an intensity that suggested he knew more than he appeared to. That night, as he prepared for bed, George found another note, this time fallen near his bed. He knows what he's doing. His hands trembled as he held the paper. The same handwriting as the previous note, the same unsettling sensation of familiarity. Thor approached, touching his nose to George's hand, as if trying to reassure him. The old man looked into the animal's eyes, seeking answers to the questions that were beginning to form in his confused mind. There was something in the past, something important that his memory was desperately trying to reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to be pronounced. Before lying down, George went to the window, observing the silent street. For a brief moment, he had the impression of seeing a shadow moving among the trees across the street. Thor stood by his side, a low and protective growl escaping his throat. The old man closed the curtains, trying to ignore the growing sensation that his life was about to change drastically. Thor's presence had completely transformed the routine in the house on Maple Street. The dog demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of George's needs, anticipating his moments of confusion and acting as a silent guardian. On mornings when the old man woke up disoriented, it was Thor who guided him to the kitchen, sitting patiently next to the cabinet where the medicines were kept. On one of these mornings, while having his coffee, George observed Thor with increased attention. There was something in the animal's behavior that awakened strange sensations in his confused mind, as if each of the dog's movements was a piece of a puzzle he couldn't put together. Suddenly, Thor raised his ears and fixed his gaze on the kitchen window, his body tense like a violin string. "What is it, buddy?" asked George, following the dog's gaze. For an instant, he had the impression of seeing a figure quickly pass through the backyard. Thor didn't bark, but his low and continuous growl made the hairs on the back of George's neck stand up. That same afternoon, while organizing some old drawers, an attempt to keep his mind occupied, George found a box of photographs he didn't remember storing. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the dusty lid. The first photo he saw made his heart race. It was a faded image of a smiling young man, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember who it was. Thor, who until then had been resting on the living room rug, approached with interest. Upon seeing the photograph, the dog emitted a different sound, something between a whimper and a cry. George looked at him, intrigued, and for a fleeting moment had the sensation that he had seen those brown eyes somewhere else, in another time. "Do you know this person, Thor?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The dog responded by touching his nose to the photograph, his eyes showing a deep sadness that George didn't fully understand. That's when he noticed something written on the back of the photo, a date and some words that time had made almost illegible. He could only make out one name, Michael. The mention of that name provoked an unexpected reaction in his mind, as if someone had turned on a switch in a dark room. Fragments of memory began to emerge, still hazy and disconnected, but insistent. The following night, events took an even more mysterious turn. George woke up startled by a noise coming from the living room. Thor wasn't in his usual place beside the bed. The old man's heart raced when he heard footsteps in the hallway, human footsteps. He tried to get up, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Suddenly, Thor appeared at the bedroom door, his posture alerting that something was wrong. The dog showed no aggression, but there was an urgency in his behavior that George had never seen before. With silent steps, Thor guided the old man to the living room. The moonlight entering through the window revealed that the front door was ajar, although George was sure he had locked it before going to bed. On the coffee table there was a new note. This time the message was longer. "The answers are closer than you think. Look in the attic." George felt a chill run down his spine. The attic was a place he had avoided for years, a repository of memories that his fragile mind could no longer process. Thor leaned against his leg as if offering support, his eyes shining with ancient wisdom in the dim light of the room. The next morning, Mrs. Nancy appeared earlier than usual, bringing fresh bread and a worried expression on her face. "Mr. George, I need to tell you something. Last night I saw lights on in your house at a very strange hour. I even thought about calling the police, but when I looked again, everything was dark." Thor, who normally greeted Mrs. Nancy with joy, remained unusually serious throughout the visit. His eyes alternated between George and the stairs leading to the attic, as if trying to communicate something important. After the neighbor's departure, George sat for a long time in his armchair, observing Thor. The dog had brought something new into his life, beyond simple companionship. He had brought mysteries, yes, but also a strange sense of purpose, as if each inexplicable event was part of a larger plan. "What are you trying to show me, friend?" muttered George, more to himself than to the dog. Thor approached, placing his head on his lap, his eyes conveying a silent message that seemed to say, "You'll understand at the right time." That afternoon, as a light rain fell outside, George gathered the courage to go up to the attic. Thor faithfully followed him, his firm steps contrasting with the old man's hesitant gait. The accumulated dust made George cough as he opened the door, but something compelled him to continue. Deep in his confused mind, a certainty began to form. The answers he sought were there, hidden among the shadows of the past, waiting to be discovered. The attic was a labyrinth of dusty boxes and furniture covered by yellowed sheets from time. The weak light entering through the small circular window created dancing shadows on the walls, giving life to the forgotten memories that inhabited that space. Thor walked ahead of George, as if he knew exactly where to go. The dog stopped in front of an old wooden chest, covered by a thick layer of dust. His nose gently touched the rusted lock, and his eyes turned to George with an expression that seemed to say, "It's here." The old man felt his hands tremble as he knelt with difficulty beside the chest. "I don't remember this chest," he muttered, running his fingers over the rough surface. But something in his heart said that this object held important secrets. With effort, he managed to open the lid, which creaked in protest against the movement after years of immobility. Inside the chest, he found a series of carefully organized objects: old letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, and a diary with a faded red cover. Thor sat beside him, his presence conveying a comforting calm as George began to explore this treasure trove of memories. The first photograph he picked up made his heart leap. It was the same image of the young man he had found the day before, but this time there were more people in the photo. Her complete family smiled at the camera, himself, younger Martha, and the young man he was now beginning to recognize. On the back of the photo, a date, Christmas 1985, and a note, "Michael, our beloved son." George's hands began to tremble violently. Michael, his son. How could he have forgotten? Thor gently leaned against his arm, as if feeling his anguish. The old man continued rummaging through the chest, finding more photographs and documents that gradually filled in the gaps in his memory. In one of the more recent photos, dated 5 years ago, Michael appeared next to a large dog with a brown coat, with the same expressive eyes that now watched him. Thor. George's heart almost stopped. In the photo, his son smiled, hugging the animal, and on the back was written, "Thor, my faithful companion." "Are you Michael's dog?" asked George, his voice choked with emotion. Thor responded with a low whimper, his eyes fixed on the old man's, as if confirming the discovery. Deeper in the chest, he found the diary. Upon opening it, he recognized his son's handwriting, the same as the mysterious notes that had been appearing around the house. The yellowed pages contained records of recent years, including notes about his concern for his father's health and the progression of Alzheimer's. The last entry in the diary, dated 3 years ago, made George freeze. "Dad, if you ever find this diary, know that Thor has a mission. He will take care of you when I can no longer be present. Trust him, Dad. He knows what he's doing." Tears streamed down George's wrinkled face as memories began to reorganize in his confused mind. Michael had left on a business trip 3 years ago and never returned. The searches were fruitless, and the pain of loss, combined with Alzheimer's, had caused his mind to block out many of these memories. Thor, who had remained silent until then, moved closer, placing his head on George's lap. The old man hugged the dog, feeling the warmth of his body, the loyalty that transcended time and circumstances. Thor wasn't just a lost dog seeking shelter on a stormy night. He was a messenger, a guardian sent by his son to protect him. A noise downstairs caught the attention of both. Thor immediately became alert, his ears moving in the direction of the sound. George put the diary in his coat pocket, and with the dog's help slowly stood up. Something told him that the revelations of that afternoon in the attic were just the beginning of a much larger story. As they descended the stairs, George realized that his mind was clearer than it had been in a long time. The memories, though still fragmented, were beginning to make sense. Thor walked by his side no longer as a simple pet, but as a living link to his past, a guardian of secrets that were gradually coming to light. In the living room, they found another note on the table. The message, written in the same familiar handwriting, simply said, "The truth is closer than you imagine." George looked at Thor, who kept his eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the afternoon was beginning to fall, and with it, the certainty that new mysteries awaited to be unraveled. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. Night fell over Willow Creek, bringing with it a different kind of restlessness. After the discoveries in the attic, George felt simultaneously more lucid and more disturbed. Michael's diary rested on his nightstand, its pages holding secrets that still needed to be fully unraveled. Thor remained alert, his attentive eyes alternating between the window and the door, as if expecting something to happen. Mrs. Nancy had appeared at the end of the afternoon, bringing with her not just an orange cake, but also information that made George's heart tighten. "You know, Mr. George, that man I saw the other day, he showed up again. This time he was staring fixedly at your house, taking pictures with a cell phone. When he realized I was watching, he quickly got into a black car and left." Thor, upon hearing the neighbor's account, emitted a low protective growl. There was something different in his behavior, an urgency that George hadn't noticed before. The dog began to circle the house, checking each window, each door, as if preparing an invisible defense. It was past 9 o'clock when George decided to retire. The emotional exhaustion from the day's discoveries weighed on his aged shoulders. As he prepared for bed, his hands found another note carefully folded on his pillow. "He's coming, stay strong." Michael's handwriting, now so familiar after reading the diary, seemed more urgent in this note. George felt a shiver run down his spine. Thor, who hadn't left his side since the discoveries in the attic, suddenly became tense, his ears moving in the direction of the living room. A subtle noise, almost imperceptible, coming from the front door, made George's heart race. Thor immediately positioned himself between the old man and the bedroom door, his body emanating a protective energy that George had never felt before. The minutes that followed seemed to drag on forever. The silence of the night was broken only by the ticking of the clock in the living room and Thor's controlled breathing. That's when they heard it, cautious footsteps in the hallway, slowly approaching the bedroom. George felt his entire body tremble, but an unexpected courage, perhaps, fueled by the recent discoveries about his son, kept him steady. Thor remained motionless, his muscles tense like violin strings, but strangely he didn't emit any threatening sound. The doorknob turned slowly, and the dim light from the hallway revealed a male silhouette. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The stranger took a step into the room, and the light from the bedside lamp revealed his face, a face that made George's heart nearly stop. "Jack," whispered George, recognizing his son's former business partner. The man seemed as surprised as he was, especially upon seeing Thor, who maintained his protective posture but without showing aggression. "Mr. George," replied Jack, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't expect to find you awake. Nor did I expect to see Thor here." The dog moved slowly, positioning himself between the two men, his intelligent eyes studying Jack's every movement. There was something in the animal's behavior that suggested he knew this nocturnal visitor well. "You knew Thor was here?" asked George, his mind working faster than it had in years. "Do you have something to do with the notes?" Jack ran his hand over his face, visibly nervous. "The notes? What notes?" His surprise seemed genuine, but there was something more in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps? Thor remained attentive, his body still tense, as if waiting for the right moment for some action. "I need to tell you something about Michael," Jack finally said, his voice laden with an emotion that George couldn't fully decipher. "Something I discovered recently, something that will change everything we thought we knew about his disappearance." Thor, upon hearing Michael's name, emitted a low sound, almost like a whimper. His eyes, fixed on Jack, seemed to carry the weight of a long-kept secret. George felt his heart race even more. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to move, and he had the feeling that the truth, however painful it might be, would finally come to light. "Sit down," said George, indicating the bedroom armchair. "I think we all have a lot to talk about tonight." Thor lay down at George's feet, his eyes never leaving Jack, like a silent sentinel guarding not just the present, but also the secrets of the past that were about to be revealed. The silence that hung in the room was as dense as fog on a winter morning. Jack sat in the indicated armchair, his restless hands betraying his nervousness. Thor maintained his strategic position, his attentive eyes alternating between the two men, as if following an invisible chess match. "Mr. George," Jack began, his voice trembling slightly, "3 years ago, when Michael disappeared, we all thought it had been an accident during that business trip. But the truth is very different." He paused as if seeking courage to continue. "Michael discovered irregularities in our company, a scheme that involved powerful people. He gathered evidence, documented everything, but before he could report he was threatened." Thor emitted a low sound upon hearing these words, as if confirming the story. George felt his heart tighten, fragmented memories beginning to fit together like pieces of a painful puzzle. "Michael didn't disappear," Jack continued. "He entered a protection program. He left everything behind to stay safe, including Thor. But before he left, he sought me out. He asked me to take care of you, Mr. George, to keep you safe too. But the notes," George began, his mind clearer than it had been in years. "If it wasn't you, then who—" As if answering the unfinished question, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Thor immediately stood up, but his posture wasn't one of alert. It was one of recognition. A figure appeared in the doorway, and time seemed to freeze. "Dad," said a voice that George thought he would never hear again. Michael was there, older, thinner, but alive. Thor ran to him, jumping and barking joyfully for the first time since his arrival at the house. George felt his legs weaken. Michael crossed the room, in 3 long strides, supporting his father before he fell. The embrace that followed carried the weight of 3 years of absence, of longing, of unspoken words. "You were here all along?" asked George between tears. "The notes." "Yes, Dad," Michael replied, still embracing his father. "When I learned that your Alzheimer's was getting worse, I couldn't stay away. Jack helped me monitor your safety from a distance, but it was Thor who really took care of you. He always knew where to find me, always knew I would return." The dog sat next to the two, his eyes shining with a wisdom that transcended human understanding. He had fulfilled his mission, not just protecting George, but also keeping the connection between father and son alive until it was safe for Michael to return. "The people involved in the scheme were arrested yesterday," Michael explained, sitting on the edge of the bed. "That's why I could come back. Jack helped me gather the last necessary evidence. Now we're all safe." Mrs. Nancy, who had been alerted by Jack earlier, appeared at the bedroom door with teary eyes. "I knew something different was happening in this house," she said, smiling through tears. "Thor wasn't an ordinary dog. He was a guardian angel." The following hours were filled with explanations, hugs, and tears of joy. Michael recounted how he managed to enter the house during the night to leave the notes, always under Thor's complicit vigilance. The dog, now more relaxed, lay at the foot of the bed, satisfied to see his family reunited again. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight crossed the bedroom window, George woke up feeling different. His mind was clearer, as if his son's return had dissipated part of the fog that Alzheimer's had created. Thor was still there, faithful guardian, but now his gaze carried a new serenity, the serenity of one who has fulfilled a sacred mission. Michael decided to move back into his father's house, transforming the old office into his bedroom. The routine gradually established itself, now filled with the laughter that had been absent for so long. Thor finally could relax his constant vigil, although he never ceased to keep a protective eye on his reunited family. Stories about the dog that brought a son back to his father began to circulate around Willow Creek. Some said that Thor was more than just a simple animal, that there was something mystical in his wise eyes and unconditional devotion. George, however, knew that the true magic lay in love. The love of a son who never gave up on his father, the love of a dog that served as a bridge between 2 worlds, and the love of a family that, even separated by fate, found its way back home. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of old George, Thor, and Michael has touched your hearts. For more heartwarming stories like this one, which make us believe in the power of love and loyalty, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Leave your like and share in the comments your own stories of miraculous reunions. We've prepared a special playlist with equally touching narratives. Find the link in the description below. After all, as Thor taught us, Sometimes angels have 4 paws and a heart bigger than the world. We'll be back soon with more stories that will warm your souls.